Lauren Pruitt. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lauren Pruitt. I am a staff attorney at FreeState Justice. I'm also the pro bono coordinator. I use the pronoun she, her. I went to Howard University for undergrad and Georgetown University for law school. I focus on a broad range of legal matters for Free State, but mostly specialize in things like expungements and employment discrimination. For Free State Justice serves low-income LGBTQ Marylanders.
Hey everyone, my name is Maddie Welder. My pronouns are he, him. I'm an education and outreach specialist at Free State Justice. I am currently in a doctoral program at Shenandoah, and I, in my position at Free State, design and facilitate LGBTQ training, whether it's kind of one-on-one or more content specific. And I'm also a cat dad to Penelope, who you may see pop up somewhere because she's kind of hyper right now.
And just to give you a little bit of background on Free State Justice for those of you who might not be familiar. Again, we serve low-income LGBTQ Marylanders. We have three basic, I would say, like sections of work that we do. So the first one is direct legal services. So I'm part of our legal team. We focus on a wide variety of legal services, but a lot of our work is regarding name change and legal decree of gender identity. We also work on discrimination cases, family law, health insurance. As I stated earlier, we do work with individuals on getting their records expunged. And then we also provide referrals. We have a wide range of pro bono attorneys that work with us that we can also place cases with when we do not have the capacity ourselves. The second bucket is advocacy and outreach. So we advocate for systemic policy and law changes. We partner with other LGBTQ focused organizations in outreach efforts, and do as much work as we can in the community, especially around the Baltimore City, Baltimore County areas. And third, education and trainings like this one. So again, our focus is the legal rights of LGBTQ Marylanders. We do a lot of trainings regarding best practices when engaging with members of the LGBTQ communities, and also cultural readiness.
All right, so before we get into to employment discrimination, just want to take a quick look at some terminology. So first, with birth sex, that's a person, female or male sex assigned at birth, generally done by a doctor and indicated on a birth certificate. Gender identity is someone's deeply held internal sense of their gender, generally male, female, or somewhere else on the gender spectrum, whether that is no gender or a mix of various genders. Now, transgender is an individual whose gender identity doesn't align with their birth sex, and cisgender is an individual whose gender identity is consistent with their birth sex. So I myself identify as trans, my birth certificate, my birth sex, female, and I now identify as male. Now, non-binary is a person whose gender is not exclusively male or female, so they may identify as having no gender, a gender other than male or female, or more than one gender. As a reminder, trans or transgender is an adjective, so I myself am a trans man, or another one would be trans woman. So gender expansive is a person who has gender characteristics and or behaviors that do not conform to traditional or societal gender expectations. Gender expression is how an individual chooses to communicate or express their gender identity to the outside world. And that can be through their clothing, their mannerisms, their hairstyle, social interactions, from the way you walk to the way that you sit, right? Then we have sexual orientation, and that describes the individual's emotional, physical, and or romantic attraction to another individual. But an important thing to remember is that sexual orientation does not equal gender identity. So, for example, a trans individual, they may identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, pansexual. So because of their gender identity, that does not dictate what their sexual orientation is. And digging a little bit deeper into understanding transition, it's important to remember that gender transition is different for everyone. It may include name change, pronoun change, the changing of clothing and their appearance, legal IDs, and even medical aspects. So for myself, my pronouns change, my clothing and appearance change. There's medical aspects that have changed. But my name, Madison, my full name is Madison. I go by Maddie. That's the name I was given at birth, and that's the name I'm keeping because I'm comfortable with that name. So not everybody has to go through every single step. It's not the same for everybody. But it is important to remember that all trans people are entitled to the same dignity and respect, regardless of which steps they may have taken, they plan to take, or may never even take. All right, I'm gonna pass it off to Lauren.
All right, thanks, Maddie. So let's talk a little bit about employment discrimination. So first, we're gonna kind of discuss where individuals' rights come from, especially when it relates to working within the federal government. So first, you have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This prohibits sex discrimination in employment. Numerous courts and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission have agreed that discrimination because an employee or even a job applicant is transgender or gender nonconforming, or because he or she fails to conform to certain gender stereotypes, including their sexual orientation, is sex discrimination under Title VII. So some of you may have heard of the Bostock decision that happened last year. And this was extremely important because it gave the basis for a lot of the rights that many states already had, but other states that didn't. It became very important to make sure that, the LGBTQ community was, had those rights, the same rights that everyone else has, the right to be, employed and be respected, at whatever your current workplace is. The Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, this prohibits discrimination by the federal government on the basis of conduct which does not adversely affect the performance of an applicant or an employee. And this includes being a member of the LGBTQ community. So being, your sexual orientation or being, transgender, if that generally does not affect your conduct. Therefore, it cannot affect the fact that you are employed in the armed services. We have 2 executive orders here, and I'm sure it'll come back on the screen. We have 13087 and 13672. So the first one prohibits discrimination in federal employment based on your sexual orientation or gender identity. And again, an executive order comes from the president. So these are important just to ensure that, employers and employees understand that the rights of the LGBTQ community are, going to be protected and are protected And it's just, another form of, making sure that, we are all on the same page. And so these affect the federal government, but of course, states, as the federal government goes, states will go. And so the next executive order prohibits anti-LGBT discrimination by federal contractors. So if you work for a company that contracts with the federal government, you are also protected. So very important.
I just wanted to apologize. My Zoom cut out for a second.
Not a problem. So looking at employment rights, first, gender-based harassment is unlawful. It's against federal employment policy. When it gets to a point where it's severe and pervasive, and if the agency does not take reasonable steps to stop it, obviously the individual has, the right to file a complaint with the EEOC. Maryland has a similar agency called the MCCR, which is the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights. Both agencies, you have 180 days. The nice thing about the MCCR is that you have 180 days to file with them, and then you have an additional 180 days to file with the EEOC. So it definitely gives an individual time to gather evidence, gather witnesses, and to file if they feel like they have been discriminated against at work. Jokes, any type of derogatory comments about transgender people, or any type of intrusive or disrespectful personal questions can constitute harassment. And obviously supervisors should take steps to stop that behavior immediately, even, before an employee has to go to HR or, at the most file a complaint with the EEOC or MCCR. You have the right to transition at work. So if you're, if an individual is or ready to transition at work, they should contact their HR department, contact their supervisor, and inform them of their transition plans. And both HR and the supervisor should be there to focus on the needs of the employee to make the transition at work, as easy as possible. They should be respectful and help them plan for the necessary steps to come, which includes things like changing their name. There could be other things that need to be changed within the systems at work. Of course, when it comes to notifying other employees and other supervisors that employee works with, it should be, that employee should be included in that, and that helping them to decide basically when to inform their coworkers. And this just becomes, everyone should be on the same page, and it should be a positive environment, and not negative. People do have the right to dress accordingly to their gender identity. Dress codes should be applied to transgender individuals or employees just the same way they're applied to other employees of the same gender. They shouldn't be there to prevent someone from transitioning or living full-time in, consistent with their gender identity. Additionally, when we're talking about the federal government, the Office of Personnel Management has issued guidance encouraging agencies to eliminate gender-based dress codes altogether. And so these are the kind of the steps we're working towards to, allow people the freedom to come to work as they deem appropriate for their gender identity, because there's not one, there's not two, there's not one, particular way for any individual to express themselves. Managers, supervisors, coworkers, they should use a person's preferred name, preferred pronouns. They should use the correct names and pronouns in employee records and in communications about that employee. It's kind of, really simple. You have a right to be called by your chosen name and gender appropriate pronouns. It can be really helpful to, add pronouns, especially like in Zoom calls and on your in your email, on your name block, and everyone should do it, not just LGBTQ members of that particular workforce. But if everyone does it, then it becomes kind of, common use, and people can, feel respected and included. Let's see, agencies cannot demand medical or legal documentation of a person's gender as a condition to access certain restrooms. They can't limit individuals to using a specific restroom separate from other employees. Office of Professional Management has also encouraged agencies to designate all single-user restrooms as unisex or gender neutral. However, they should never try to say, like, a transgender employee can only use those bathrooms. So you should be allowed to use restrooms and locker rooms consistent with your gender identity, and anyone should be allowed to use single-use restrooms if those are the restrooms that they choose to use. Information about an employee's transition should only be shared with their consent, right? Everyone has a right to privacy. That's why it's important that, the notifying of other individuals that the employee works with, they should be involved in that notification. Because although it's not necessarily a medical condition, there are, medical aspects that could come along with explaining, their transition, and it should just be their choice and what is stated and how it's stated and when it's stated. An employee should never be required to share specific medical information as a condition of transitioning at work or a condition to use certain facilities. Like I said, using certain, a particular restroom or a particular locker room, there should be no requirement of, a doctor's note or medical, a letter of medical necessity or things like that, to use the bathroom at your workplace. And of course, confidential information about employees should not be disclosed except when legally necessary. So if we're talking about the federal government, and you're thinking about someone who has maybe a security clearance, they might be required to, provide some medical information regarding their transition. But again, it'll be kept in strict confidence, and will not be shared with others in the workforce that, do not need that information. You have the right to have your employee records fully updated. So, and this includes even if you haven't legally changed your name or gotten like an LGI or something, or something like that. If your preferred name has changed, you should be able to update your records. OPM or the office has instructed that employees' official personnel file can list an employee's chosen name in most of their communications, and encourages agencies to allow the use of their name for purposes such as like their email accounts or employee directories, business cards, name badges, even without a legal name change, right? So this is that person's name for all intents and purposes, and therefore should be used. And so there might be instances where data systems have to be updated in order to capture that information, but that is the direction that we're moving to, and that's what's important. Now, when looking at health insurance, especially, and this is health insurance through your company, everyone has, if you have health insurance offered by your agency, if you're not a trans person, then you have health insurance if you are a trans person. Like it's, there is, there should be no difference. You must be allowed to participate in your employer's health insurance plan. This is looking at federal plans. They have, the OPM or Office of Professional Management has stated that federal employee plans should not have blanket transgender exclusions. This means plans should cover transition-related care that is prescribed by a healthcare provider as being medically necessary for that individual. Obviously, plans, can have different ideas or different details on what is medically necessary, and that's between the individual and their doctor. If for some reason you are or an individual is denied coverage, they obviously have a right to appeal just as anyone else, but there can't be a blanket denial just because it's a service related to transitioning. So you also have the right for your insurance records and cards to reflect your gender. This can be very important because in transitioning, there might be care that you would need that may not be covered under another gender or your gender assigned at birth. And this also brings in another issue that we see a lot in our work, is that there are times when a person transitions and is able to change their gender, but then still might need care, for physical reasons. And we have to make sure that they're not denied that care because of their gender. So there is a lot that goes into, transitioning, and we just want to make sure that, people are respected, and that especially when it comes to, medical and health insurance, that people are given the best care possible and not shorted because of, their right to transition. So you have the right to coverage of medical exams and screenings, regardless of your gender. Also, with related to health insurance is when your spouse is covered by your medical insurance. Your transitioning should not affect, your spouse's right to care under your employer's medical insurance plan. So if you're legally married at the time of transition, that transition does not affect the validity of your marriage. Spousal insurance and benefits and other benefits should be continued, even though your records reflect a new name and a new new name and or gender.
All righty, thank you, Lauren. So now we're going to get into the U.S. Transgender Survey. So this is the largest survey ever conducted in the U.S. With over 27,000 respondents, and it was conducted in 50 states, D.C., military bases, Puerto Rico, Guam, and it was adults, so 18 and up, and was available in English and Spanish online. There's a whole lot of data and information about the experiences of trans individuals, and generally federal surveys don't identify trans or LGBTQ plus people. So generally there's limited information. Luckily we have the U.S. Trans Survey, and I believe they had intended on doing one last year, but it was postponed, and I believe they're currently working on one. Ezra, am I correct on that? Do you know?
Yes, you're correct on that.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I didn't want to lie to everybody. But this information is collected. The information that's collected is definitely crucial for advocacy, because it proves that trans people exist, and it shows what trans individuals go through, what the experiences are, and it covers a variety of topics. So first, we're going to start with pervasive mistreatment and violence. So there's high levels of mistreatment and violence in many areas of the respondents' lives, and this includes schools, family life, and even within the workplace or their employment. So because individuals identify as trans, 46% were verbally harassed in the past year, and 9% were physically attacked. And then 10% in the last year were sexually assaulted, and 47% reported they were sexually assaulted within their lifetime. looking at severe economic hardship and instability, trans individuals had 3 times higher unemployment rates than the general U.S. population, and were twice as high, had twice as higher poverty rates than the U.S. population. So 29% versus 12%. And then finally, looking specifically at employment and the workplace, 16% of respondents who have been unemployed reported losing at least one job because of their gender identity or their gender expression. And then 30% of the respondents who had a job in the past year reported being either fired, denied a promotion, or experiencing some other form of mistreatment in the workplace. And it was solely related to their gender identity or expression. And some of the forms of mistreatment include being harassed or even physically attacked. And then in the past year, 27% of those who held or applied for a job reported being fired or denied because of their gender identity or expression. And then 15% of those respondents who had a job were verbally harassed, physically attacked, and or sexually assaulted at work because of their gender identity. So now I'm going to pass it over to Lauren, who's going to talk a little bit about how to create an affirming environment, how to address any harassment or discrimination that you may witness within the workplace.
Right. Thank you so much, Maddie. Knowing those statistics are really, really helpful. So creating an affirming environment, right? So this is something that's proactive. So that's what we want people to kind of realize is that, it's not something that you can kind of do passively. We need people to, be proactive about being inclusive and affirming people's identity. If you are the owner of a business, this can only help your business grow, to give people that space. So first, make it clear that you serve trans clients or have trans employees on either through information or images on your website or promotional materials. Just take a look at materials that you are handing out, and when you look at them, are they what you would call inclusive? Are all of your clientele represented? And that can be a great way to start creating this affirming environment. Create a safe space for employees. You can use signs or visible indications that this is a safe space. That's kind of like the open door policy, that we hear talked about, but you want to make sure people really know that, if there's an issue or if they feel, unwelcome at work, that there is a place they can go to and talk to someone who will address that situation. I talked a lot about bathrooms regarding like with federal government. And this is really important. I mean, that's kind of like the most basic, need that a person has. And so we want to make sure that, when people come to work, they are able to, find a bathroom. It's that simple. So designated gender neutral bathrooms, make it a policy that clients can use the bathroom according to their gender identity, support them when they do. If there's a, individual, another client or an employee that has a problem with it, just addressing the situation, explaining, just the overall policy and, standing behind it. And that can be really, really important. Ensure confidentiality. And this includes like office visits and phone calls. You want to make sure that clients or employees know that their trans status is always considered confidential and it won't be disclosed unless, they have given their express permission. Having a system that shows a client's name, their name of common use can go a long way, so that a person doesn't have to explain to each person that they're talking to, okay, well, that is, my legal name or the name on my documents, but this is my preferred name and this is why. They might not be in a place where they can, talk about it. And then there might be other folks around listening if it's in person. And so you just want to, keep those types of conversations, to a minimum, so that that person can just be there and get the work done that they need and not have to kind of out themselves on, at the beginning of every conversation within that particular organization or agency. Non-discrimination statements are really important. I'm trying to think, I saw one today and I was kind of surprised. It might have actually been on Zoom, but just at the bottom of, the website just made a statement about, their non-discrimination policy. And so when people see those types of things, either on your website or in materials, again, that can go a long way to creating this affirming environment. Include terms like gender identity or expression. So it's not, that's letting a person know that they can be who they are, right, within your walls or within your organization. And, again, that creates a supportive environment. It creates individuals who are happy and, generally more productive. So it just only makes sense. And then I mentioned this earlier, including pronouns in signature blocks. And, we can all use it. My pronouns are she, her. I do my gender identity. I dress a bit more, if to use like technical terms, I guess, maybe masculine. And so it's helpful for me to express that those are my terms that I use, she and her. And it shouldn't just be, a person who's a member of the LGBTQ community who has to express those things. We want to see, everyone expressing them, and that way everyone can feel included and respected, right, in the same way.
I totally agree, and it leaves that space for others to introduce their pronouns as well. Lauren, we have a question in the chat. They say, I'm interested in advocacy for LGBTQ plus employees of religious institutions, since religious institutions have an exemption allowing them to discriminate. What can be done to secure rights for LGBTQ plus employees, regardless of their employer's religious beliefs?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously something that is kind of in and out of the courts, and to me, there just hasn't been, we haven't gotten to that landmark case that really will hit the nail on the head and say kind of which one is more important. They're always able to kind of find some other part of the case that will resolve that issue without really talking about, religion versus, someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, or, just in general being a member of the LGBTQ community. I think for me, this is going to come down to like local ordinances and like, city councils and, a lot of, these types of religious institutions get, tax breaks and have a lot of, obviously get, donations and money from government agencies. And so it's going to take, requiring some of these agencies to require them to not discriminate in order to get the funds. And I think, there was a lot of talk about that regarding private schools and, whether or not they should be allowed to receive federal funds and discriminate against LGBTQ youth. With the last administration, it was definitely not cleared up in any way. But, it's just going to take kind of like a grassroots effort. And, the one thing is that it just takes training and it takes educating individuals. And, it's going to take the parents at these schools to say, we want our kids to be surrounded by all types of people, all races, all religions, and, regardless of, gender identity or, a member of like being a member in the trans community. We don't want the schools that we send our kids to discriminate. And, so it's going to take time, but as far as it's just we're just not there yet. We're just not there yet to fight some of these religious exemptions. And, the only thing that we can do is to, not utilize them and not support, politicians that support, diverting funds their way. It's just gonna, and it's gonna take time.
Perfect. Thank you, Lauren.
So looking at creating inclusive policies, right? So whenever possible, just eliminating gender distinctions, men shall wear such and such and such and such, women shall wear, those types of things. Just, a blanket statement as to what types of clothing are inappropriate for that workplace, and without the distinctions based on gender, is the kind of the direction that most organizations are going towards. Thinking about data, again, data is extremely important. So we need to make sure that our employees are that we're keeping the data regarding names of common use and pronouns, and that we're training our staff. I think I mentioned before, if like every time you had to talk with someone on the phone, or wanted to ask a question about something regarding a particular organization, and you had to out yourself, I mean, that's not going to make the experience very very positive. So data is going to be a big part of it. Technology, utilizing some of these data processing, there's like a ton of different apps and all these types of things, and access type technologies that we have to utilize to make sure that people's information, one, is safeguarded, but two, is accessible by the employees that need it, and they can use it accordingly. We want to insist that courts, employers, and anyone who works with a particular client use their name of common use correct pronouns, and that basic respect is shown. It's, it really can't, get much simpler than that. We want people to be an advocate, don't overlook mistreatment. If you're in court and, the opposing counsel is, misgendering, your client or another client, it takes 1 second to just stand up and say, we have to ask the court to make sure that, opposing counsel doesn't allow their client to misgender, my client, or, if you have an employee or coworker that is misgendering another coworker, when that coworker is not around to stand up for themselves, it takes, again, 1 second to say, that individual goes by she and her. I would appreciate if you use it, from now on. And supervisors and things like that should be paying attention to those types of, mistreatments, and making sure that they are, something that doesn't become pervasive, right? We want to make sure that everyone feels included, everyone feels respected. And acknowledge when a trans client has had a negative experience. A lot of times people don't want to talk about things that are negative, but if they're telling you something is negative, or you overheard the negative experience, acknowledge it, right? And then talk about how it can be different, and try to change that negative at least to a positive by the time they are leaving your organization, or finished with whatever business they had. And then, of course, take steps to correct it, whether it's going to a supervisor, or if you are the supervisor, adding in additional trainings, or, one-on-ones with that employee, so that they understand what went wrong and how they can, do better. It's just all about, making sure people feel included and not excluded. There's a large number, especially in the trans community, who, for example, as a lawyer, when they go to court, have, talked about, people within the court talking about them, or, laughing, or, all types of things that you wouldn't think about in such a, professional setting. And those are the types of things like we can't have. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's, a gas station or restaurant, you want people to feel respected. And just as you were, kind of like the golden rule, you treat others like you would want to be treated. And it's, it's really just that simple. And of course, addressing mistreatment and harassment, I've touched on this a little bit, but when any such behavior is reported or observed, it should immediately be taken seriously and addressed immediately. You don't want to blame the victim, you don't want to, it's not the victim's fault, and so, there are many different steps that can be taken, whether it's a one-on-one training or an entire organization-wide training. But it has to be done. It has to be done immediately. You can't wait, and think that, oh, it'll go away, or, they'll get used to the individual, so then they'll stop. It should just be talked about. And sometimes those types of trainings and things can help, because a lot of times people are afraid of things that they don't know. And so if this is the first trans individual that they've met, it can be very helpful if there is some explanation for them to understand that this is an individual, they have a right to be who they are just as they do, and can be really affirming for that person to know that they have the support of their organization and their supervisors. So most importantly, so you have the policies that create an affirming environment. Most importantly is that all staff must be trained on those policies, and then they also must be enforced. So, the trainings have to be taken seriously, and that way the staff knows that they'll be held accountable. And, with that accountability comes responsibility, and, we'll just see better environments for all. And that's what's important. And, not just members of the LGBTQ community, but, members of, those who are, have, all other classes that are protected classes, right? This is just the way to treat people. And so, that's what we at FreeState Justice and a lot of other organizations in Maryland and around the US, that's what we're fighting for. And so we want to make sure that people are treated fairly, people are treated equitably, and of course are able to, live their lives just like anyone else. And I think I'll send it to Maddie to discuss steps.
I completely agree. Yep.
And I think our last slide is just regarding kind of a wrap up that, what resources and organizations a person can, look towards if they need additional information. Let's see if
Sorry about that. It went out again. So to wrap it up, kind of like what Lauren was talking about, what affirming employment looks like. So I know we have a few people here, and if you don't mind putting in the chat, what does affirming employment look like where you work? What are ways at your place of employment that you can create that affirming environment? I know for myself personally, I have another job alongside my position with FreeState, and it's at a grocery store. And anytime somebody talks about one of the other employees who's a part of the LGBTQ community, I've had to step up and address using the wrong pronouns or using an individual's dead name or the incorrect name. And so that's kind of my way of creating that affirming environment within that workplace. We have Ash, who said, for me, my supervisor normalizing pronoun use and her signature, and there we go. And always getting my pronouns right, the big affirmation, allowing pronouns on business cards, for sure. FreeState customized their case database to ensure names of common use, pronoun and other relevant info is captured. Definitely important. So a few resources in different organizations that are available, of course, FreeState Justice, GLAD, GLSEN, HRC, Human Rights Campaign, Lambda Legal. There's a whole list here. We'll provide Ash with a copy of the slide deck as well, so that everyone will have access to these resources and organizations. And that's all from us. Thank you all so much. If anybody has any questions, please feel free, type it in the chat. You also have Lauren and I's email here. If maybe you're not as comfortable, or maybe you're viewing this later on and have questions, that's definitely available for you as well. Please feel free to contact us. Thank you, Ash.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. If there's anybody who also has questions or comments that they'd rather speak, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you to have you speak. Otherwise, I just have a few things I want to promote before we close up, but I want to give people a minute to think if there's any questions. I have a question for myself. I can always ask questions, but I want to make sure our attendees have that option first. Oh, and Ezra noted that there is a typo in your email.
Oh, yep, there definitely was. I will type in the correct one in the chat right now. So since this is being recorded, if individuals can't see the chat, it's MWELDER at freestatejustice.org. There is no L before the @ sign. So
yeah, and I thankfully will have opportunity tomorrow to go through the recording and the transcription and submit it. So this should be up on the library's YouTube channel much sooner than our last session from a month ago, which just went up recently. But so I'm going to put in the chat right now a few links for those two previous sessions that we had with Free State. The first on just an overview of both federal and local protections for LGBTQ people, and then one specifically about healthcare issues. We also have another one focused on LGBTQ issues in education, focusing on K through 12 is going to be next month. And then we also have a LGBTQ focused book club that I am the co-facilitator of with one of my other colleagues. That's for adults 18 plus who are members of the community or just want to be allies. And we discuss a variety of LGBTQ related fiction mostly. We haven't really had any nonfiction titles that we have enough copies of through the system to include for that. So that might be something you want to check out as well. And I also want to highlight our Brave Voices, Brave Choices initiative, which includes both event series as well as resources, community dialogues that are focused on equity and anti-racism. So all of those links are in the chat. In the last few minutes we have, I also wanted to go back to the topic of health insurance, because that's something that I have been trying to figure out, like, do I actually get to change my gender marker with my insurance and what do I need to do for it? So my understanding has been that even though there's been the ability to like change like ID markers, you know, without any documentation, it's different for like health insurance companies. So that requires like the birth certificate change sort of thing like that. I was wondering if you guys could speak to like the policies that like are around health insurance gender markers.
Well, just from the kind of the legal side of it, it does depend on the insurance company, because the problem that people ran into when they were allowed to change. So just to give a kind of the most basic example. So someone assigned female a sex assigned as birth, right? Transitions to a man, if they allow them to change their gender within the health insurance company themselves, when that trans man turns 40 and should have a mammogram, the mammogram system would kick them out because their sex is male. And there's different requirements. The same could happen for, you know, other required medical procedures based on your sex assigned at birth. So what they have been trying to do is get rid of all of those types of requirements and then allow folks to have their gender marker changed within their system, but also allow them to get the medical care that they need based on their physical body. And so there are, I couldn't tell you which health insurance carriers are more progressive than others, but there are some that are getting rid of those, like, you know, those requirements, and just, you know, if the doctor says this person needs a mammogram, let them get a mammogram. You know, it's kind of that simple. But it's definitely based on the carrier. I'm not sure if maybe Maddie or Ezra had like different experiences or heard of different issues or something.
I haven't changed anything, so I'm gonna refer this one to Ezra.
Hey, y'all. I would say it really does just depend on the carrier. Most of the time, you know, you really shouldn't have, knock on wood, you shouldn't have too many issues in terms of actually changing the gender marker if you've updated, for example, your driver's license or something like that. They might ask you to provide that. In my experience personally, I have not had to provide that, but some do ask for that. And so for me personally, again, I didn't have any issues changing my gender marker. However, I did have kind of what Lauren was talking about in terms of, you know, at first, my insurance did not want to let me get certain medical care because it didn't align with the gender that they had on record. So oftentimes there are different carriers that have actually care navigators that are specific to trans-affirming healthcare. Like, for example, I know Kaiser Permanente actually has a trans healthcare navigator that can help with any issues like this that might arise. So I would say insurance companies are getting better at this, but yes, there are still some weird instances that happen in terms of denying healthcare and maybe even having to appeal decisions and things like that. But it is so really the summary of this would be, you probably won't have too many issues changing your gender marker with them. However, just keep an eye out and just be vigilant in terms of getting and accessing your care and jumping on those denials. And a lot of times your healthcare providers are your biggest allies when this happens. Make sure that they're aware of the situation and they can also help on their end to you know, refute a denial of service.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a good case for like, why do we even have gender markers? when they are not actually useful for not just trans people, from my understanding, but also like intersex folks. Like, I think a lot of people don't realize just how many people there are whose bodies don't fit into those categories that we expect growing up. And so like when I get my blood levels, my hormone levels checked with my blood work, I am getting it based off of like the male range, but the insurance company has female in my record. And so the results will show up compared to what is female range. And it's like, this is not accurate information. Like, this is not, you know, like, it's like a minor thing, right? And like my providers know what's up, but it's like a reminder that like, oh yes, like, it's kind of just like a little slap in the face, like every time that I have to get medical care. And it's like, there's this discrepancy that's going on. So yeah, I've kind of been like debating whether or not I actually want to go through with like getting my birth certificate changed in a different state. So I have that, because like I didn't need to change my gender through the court or anything, like to get an X on my ID. But yeah, I've been weighing that. So thank you for answering my question, because I've also been wondering about kind of what the status of that is. I don't see any other questions from anybody else. I think that's all that we have for tonight. Like I said, this is being recorded and will be up on our YouTube probably in about a week, maybe even less. And there are the previous ones. I will make sure that the resources that were mentioned tonight are in the description for the YouTube. And I believe I can also send out the slide deck directly to the people who registered or attended this event. Is that good with you guys? So thank you for attending. I hope everybody has a great night. Happy end of Pride Month. Take care of yourself, take care of your communities, and I wish you all well.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care.